How's that?
I am a professional. Do not try this at home.
Go ahead, Dick.
Okay. My name is Dick Mazziotti. I'm chairing this session. Other than that, I have nothing to say. I'm going to turn it over to the two experts, Beck and Tim Marriner, to talk about alternative methods of teaching. One of the reasons that we are having this session is that the Program Policy Committee has come up with this initiative that you all heard Clark talk about this morning. And the initiative is to try to change the attitudes of CALLERLAB. CALLERLAB has for many, many years, CALLERLAB was formed to take care of the chaos that was square dancing back in the 60s. And CALLERLAB did very nicely take care of the chaos and has ordered everything in nice, even piles. We're finding that those nice, even piles don't necessarily work as well as they ought to anymore. So we're starting to think about ways of getting outside the box but staying on the table, at least. We do need to continue the traditions of square dancing. The traditions are our basis. They're the heart of square dancing. And we need to, whatever we do, we have to make sure that we protect the traditions of square dancing. But we still have to keep the activity alive. Keeping the activity alive means bringing more people in. Bringing more people in means teaching them something. And we don't know for sure what yet. That's what these two are to talk to you about. One other little thing, if you have questions, please come up and get the mic so that we get everything on tape. There also is a sheet being passed around. Please sign in. It doesn't matter what name you sign. We're using it mainly for the number of people that are here. Any questions so far? Good. Here is Tim.
Thank you, Dick. It's fascinating that we've done a lot of brainstorming about teaching. We've had a lot of great sessions on teaching, and you can go back and you can pick up some of these best ofs on teaching, the tapes, and you get some great information on it. We are teaching, some areas are teaching 0 to something less than mainstream. Some areas are teaching 0 to mainstream in one season. Whatever that defined season or hours is in your area, it depends or it differs from region to region. And we have people who teach from 0 through plus in one teach season. We actually have people, and in all of these methods of teaching, we have a considerable amount of success, and on the other side of the coin, we have a lot of dropouts and problems pertaining to the style and the approach of what they're doing. Another thing that we are also experimenting with is that multi-cycle teaching method of teaching. It's not a program. It's a method of teaching, being able to go ahead and have something rotating in an area. And we have seen great success with that style of teaching, too. And yet, after 2 or 3 years of doing that, we also see some drawbacks in the multi-cycle program or method of teaching, rather. We're also seeing and hearing about people who are teaching in big weekend clumps. They're having a 3-Saturday session, or maybe they're having a Friday, an all-day Saturday, and a Sunday send-off session. And they're trying to teach as much as they can get just to get those people out on the floor. And we've heard a great deal of success about those types of programs, too. But one of the things and the factors that none of these methods of teaching take into consideration is the exact order of what is being presented. And that, I think, is a problem with all of the methods that you use. If you take a look at the teaching order that we have today that CALLERLAB recommends, and I think a lot of us have tried to use that method and recommendation teaching order for quite some time now, I think you'll find that a lot of us do change and vary it to some degree or another, and we've had whatever works, we remember, we make notes of it, and the following year we try it again, and we maybe make some more adjustments, and we try to tweak that form of teaching. But relatively, that list has been unchanged for the last 20, 25 years. That order has remained unchanged. And I think it's time, and I think the PPC initiative plan is really tilting in the direction of it's time to start experimenting with the method or the teaching order to see if there's a way we can fast-track some dancers now, get them right on the dance floor to affect what we're doing now. One of the biggest complaints we have always seen is we're raising all sorts of funds and a lot of money, and we're trying to do a lot of good and get advertising in, and everybody's trying to recruit, and we're trying to maintain, and yet you've not put one dancer in my room. And what is CALLERLAB doing for me? Well, in fact, CALLERLAB can do the educational side of it. We can train, we can educate callers, we can recommend and whatnot. We don't dictate anything. But it's up to each individual caller and club or organization to decide what method of teaching best suits their area and how they're going to handle it, how they're going to approach it. And I think a lot of clubs today don't take into account any financial status, or they don't take any iota of what the financial realms or qualifications, or what's the word I'm trying to find for that. They don't take into account any finances. They start off, they just think we're going to have a class, and they've been doing it the same way year after year after year, and they've been going the hole doing it the same way year after year, losing money. And so we're starting to see people think, man, we can't survive this way anymore. We're getting fewer dancers. We're paying a whole lot of outcome or a lot of money outlaid, and we're having very little residual income coming in when these folks finally graduate or they finally finish their sessions. And so I think what we really have kind of touched upon is, well, maybe we need to adjust what it is that we're showing. Maybe we need to adjust the amount, or we need to adjust the time. People want to get into it quicker. And if that's the case, then we do need to reduce the amounts of material in some cases to be able to get folks on the floor quicker. Now, that affects the new incoming group of people. That affects the people now. Your clubs and whatnot aren't affected at this point until they start getting those people. But we have a lot of problems with club dancers or dancers who do not wish to lower their proficiency to bring new people in. And that's a problem right from the get-go, that if they're a plus club and they're trying to recruit mainstream dancers, they're probably having a lot of difficulty because the members themselves really don't want to recruit. A lot of them have done it for many years, year after year, the same way. They've been angels for the groups maybe 10, 15 years, and they're kind of relatively burned out and really don't have any desire to recruit. They say they want to recruit, but really they don't want to take the time to bring somebody in and get them involved because they're about wore out, they're tired. And a little bit is self-centered, I think, because in a way, if you look at it, some age of dancers or age of the leaders today think, well, we only have 4 or 5 years. Why rock the boat? Let's just do it this way. And we're not going to make any changes. We're not going to really. We're going to survive until our funds run out. And I'm seeing across the country lots of clubs folding just because of that lack of business attitude or lack of fortitude or lack of energy and drive to come up with a new way to do something to maybe really bring in new people. If we are thinking that we need to adjust the teaching order, there's a lot of things to take into consideration. And Don has gone into a whole lot of hard work for many years to come up with some of the information, creating a good teaching order, what it takes to come up with a good teaching order, what to watch out for. I've been working in an area now for 4 or 5 years, and we've had some good results. I've modified a teaching order from 30 years of calling to a point now where I've almost got it tweaked to where I think the groups are surviving. But we started with an 8-member club, and we now have 89 couples, and that doesn't include the 5 squares that are in class now. So their enthusiasm and their drive to want to get people involved is what's really doing it. I think the teach order that I'm using is helping. It's not the answer. You still have to get them to recruit for you. But they're not going to recruit if they're burned out or if they're tired about it. And I'll explain what this teach order is after Don tells you a little bit of what it takes and how to derive and how to put something together so it fits in your area.
Thank you, Tim. I've seen, watching for 40 years of calling, what the teaching order does and what have you. And what we have listed as a CALLERLAB recommended teaching order, to me, is pretty much the teaching order that many of our longtime callers learned in. They learned it in that order, therefore it must be good enough for the rest of you. But it turns out that they learned 15 or 20 calls because that's all existed when they started dancing. And then they learned it 2 or 3 more the next year because that was created and you know, the rush of all the new experimental calls and all the new calls being added. They learned them in that order, a few at a time, and they ended up putting the newer ones at the bottom of the list. And I'd say 85, 95% of that list is the order that things were created. It's chronological. It's not the method that would be best to teach dancers in. I was not aware of what the PPC is doing, and I was not aware that they're looking into stuff like this and that they were allowing or recommending experimentation. I was thrilled that they asked me to talk about this because I stopped experimenting a long time ago, but I've been a renegade for maybe 30, 35 years when, well, it was my first wife who was a piano teacher and joined some group that was great educators, and she went to a workshop in New Jersey, about a 5-hour ride from where we lived in Massachusetts, and came back and said, boy, am I going to change the way you teach square dancing. And she did. She told me some very common sense things that have made a big difference. And one of those ingredients, there are several things about teaching that will make it a lot easier for the students to learn. One of those things, and it's not the only ingredient by a long shot, is the teaching order. And so with having researched this information from a field other than square dancing, and then refined it quite a bit with many years of teaching, I've come up with some things that, some basic principles that will help your students learn. And I can't give you a list. This is a good teaching order. I'm going to give you ingredients so that hopefully you can create your own good teaching order, or maybe some of you are on a committee that will create one. But there are variables in the teaching order that I can't give you this unless you tell me I have 5 weeks to teach, I have 30 years to teach, or 40 weeks to teach, how many lessons you're going to teach. You got to. One of the ingredients is how long you've got to teach in. One is I'm going to teach non-dancers, so to dance mainstream, I think Tim was mentioning this, or I'm going to teach non-dancers to dance plus, or I'm going to teach plus dancers to teach A1. Given the particular set of circumstances, you can create orders that will help them learn and not help them learn. I've put an outline together of what I should tell you guys about. I changed it because I was inspired by the talk this morning that we're finally allowed to experiment. I was reading through it last night, and I found out that my teaching order, teaching you, got me in trouble because page 2 didn't follow from page 3, and I found out that I stapled them together in the wrong order. but I put big letters here in the right order now so I can see it. Before I get in really to the meat of it, there's a couple more things that I want to mention. Over the years, I have talked to our Callers Association, even one group here, about teaching, which a lot of it was teaching order, and I always get the same comments. One of the main ones is, but CALLERLAB doesn't recommend it. CALLERLAB has a recommended teaching order. I think there was one time that the teaching order was written as CALLERLAB teaching order. It didn't say recommended. I think maybe 10 or 15 years ago I talked them into putting a recommended in there. But so many people still interpret recommended to mean we strongly recommend you use this teaching order. And if you ask any of the people that might have some kind of a say over it, they say no. This is available. If you can't come up with your own teaching order, this is available for you to use. And I keep saying, well, why don't you put a good one there? A better order. And we could create a better order saying it's teaching from non-dancer to mainstream in 25 weeks or whatever time period they recommend these days. The other thing that a lot of people in my local Callers Association complained about when I presented this 2 or 3 times over the years to them, we in New England have class-level balls. I think they call them jamborees and different things in different parts of the country. You know, and in November, everybody's learned all these particular calls, and whatever caller is calling for whichever clubs are gathering knows what calls to call. And the same in January, and the same. And they say, but if I teach your order, then my dancers won't be able to go to these class-level balls. And this is an important thing to teach dancers not only how to dance, but how to socialize and how to really enjoy the function of a dance and all that. My feeling is I would rather have my dancers survive in the dance program for the long run and miss out on 1 or 2 fun things in between, if it's going to mean they're going to stay in the activity longer because they can transition better. But my answer usually to the group is, I've got just the solution. We all switch to my order. You get it. All right. I actually had one caller say, you know, I'm going to do that, but then he overextended himself and never taught a class. But let's start with goals of a good teaching order. By the way, I have some handouts here. You don't have to write those things down. I'm just not going to give them out to you now because I want you to listen to me and not read these ahead because they're in a different order. Because reviewing-wise, I think it's better to go, yeah. But I think what I feel the goals of a good teaching order are. A good teaching order will help callers teach as effectively as possible. A good teaching order will help to ensure that at the end of their lessons, the dancers will be able to respond properly to the calls they encounter. A good teaching order will help minimize dancer confusion during lessons. And what minimizing dancer confusion does is minimize dancer embarrassment. Dancers, people, don't like to be embarrassed. And since they don't have to come to these classes, you can't keep them entertained. If you can't keep them from being embarrassed, they're just not going to show up next week if they're embarrassed too much. So, as they say, a good teaching order will help minimize dancer confusion during lessons and also dancer embarrassment. And lastly, I've written a good teaching order, and this one has a lot of undertones here. A good teaching order will train dancers so that they can comfortably enter their local square dance activity. If your area is dancing plus, a good teaching order will make a plus dancer at the end of your classes. We'll talk more about this later. If you're isolated and you're teaching 20 basics, a good teaching order will get your dancers to dance comfortably in that group. Groups that, I'm jumping ahead. So as I said, one of the ingredients of good teaching to help meet the goals is the teaching order. And these teaching principles that I'm going to talk about apply no matter what level you're talking about, level or program or list you're teaching from, and no matter how fast you're teaching. Now, I don't mean speed, but I mean how many weeks you're allowed to teach them. Well, if I've got 10 lessons and 100 calls, it's going to be 10 calls per, you know, it's going to be more the first night, but it all works out, yeah. It's one of the things that fall out of it. I always tell myself not to mention this, but it always comes out, because sometimes this gives me more credibility and sometimes it gives me less. But for many years, I called for the Tech Square Square Dance Club at MIT. They dance a plus level, so you have to teach non-dancers to dance in plus. And I chose to do an integrated list because of what I'm going to talk about. They also, at least that's what I was told at the time, the school requires them to allow new people to join club activities once per semester. So they teach the plus level in one semester. When I got there, it was 12 weeks. I talked them into 14. But using these principles, I came up with a teaching order that year, or semester after semester. We used to crank out dancers that went from non-dancers to plus dancers, and in 14 weeks, and they were all good dancers. We'd go out to outside dances, and most times you take your, I know people that take their new dancers out to a class, or their first dance after graduating from class. They're worried about them. They try to shelter them. They try to, what we did is basically told them about long sleeve shirts and petticoats, because we didn't care about that dancing. They had fun despite it. And most clubs enjoyed seeing these people join them because they were younger and they added energy. These were teens, they were late teens, and probably through 30 years old. We had a lot of people there, a lot of energy, a lot of good dancers. But we never worried about would they be able to dance the figures, would they be able to keep up with them. And I'm convinced that one of the several reasons is teaching order. That's right, not page 3, page 2. Here we go. Okay, so let's talk about some of the basic principles. I think I'm talking about them. I tried to list them in what I think is the most important order. The handout doesn't have them in that order. And Tim and I communicated a little beforehand, and he agrees with some of these principles and disagrees with some of the others. Mine or the microphones? Oh. Any suggestions? I'll just keep talking. Okay. Interesting enough, Tim and I agree on some of these, and others I think we disagree on, but Tim will give you his reasons later. The first one is calls that are similar, separate them. Teach separately. If you teach 2 calls that are similar, to dancers, that should still work. But if you teach dancers 2 calls that are similar, and they're learning 2 calls that are similar at the same time, when you call one of those, they're going to do one of those, not necessarily the right one. You probably all know that when there's a 50-50 chance of getting it right, there's a 70-30 chance of getting it wrong. And you don't want them to get the wrong one. So what you should do is take a call, 2 similar calls, and teach one of them now, and review it the next week. Reteach it and review it. And by 4 weeks, when they're dancing it very well, then you introduce the new one. And their mind's going to say, oh, that's my old friend such and such, and they're going to dance that one. Or they're going to say, oh, that's the new one we're working on, and they'll dance that one. And there's got a much, much better chance of dancing the correct one. Now, what do I mean by similar calls? Well, there are things like similar names and similar actions. And these examples I have in the handout too. Similar names, star through, right-hand star, shoot the star. Separate your teaching of those. Right and left through, right and left grand, or grand right and left. There's a lot of similarity there. And how do I know one from the other? Now, granted, we all know there are some cases that when you're in one formation, I can do one, and when you're in the other formation, I can do the other. But it really helps to separate them. I also have grand right and left and grand square. I'm talking to Andy Shore at the meeting this morning. We should have been listening, but we were talking. He pointed out flutter wheel and Ferris wheel, another great example of names that sound alike and should be separated. Similar actions, box the net, star through, slide through, touch a quarter. I don't have it on the list, but it should be. And when I first created the list, curlicue was added to that list, was still on it. Slip the clutch and shoot the star. They may feel different to you because they're different kind of actions, but they're both ways of getting out of a VAR. And it could be very easy to confuse one and the other if one's not an old friend before you teach the other one. How about the family of relay the deucey? Spin chain through, spin chain the gears, spin chain and exchange the gears. Did I have spin chain through? Yeah. And spin, yeah. That gets your mind spinning, doesn't it? But one at a time. And not one like the first tip and another one the second tip. I'm talking 3 or 4 weeks apart if you can do it. When you're in 14 weeks is tough. But flutter wheel and reverse flutter wheel. I think they should be separated. Tim's list has them together, so he can tell you his reasons for that. But all 8 spin the top and remake the VAR if you're working in that group. Grand right and left and weave the ring. Those are probably less likely to be confused, but do one until it's an old friend and then teach the other one. Second principle, teach hard things first. As Andy pointed out this morning's chat, that not necessarily things that are hard. We don't have hard calls. We have calls that are more involved and take more drill time. What do I mean by teach hard things first? And this is one that Tim is very much behind me in this. Some calls are more involved. They take more practice time. If you can teach it near the beginning of your series of lessons, by the time your dancers graduate and have to go out and face the real world, they will have had lots of practice time on it. If you teach it near the end, like a lot of our calls are on the list because they were invented late, they're going to learn it. They may have a week or 2 to review it, and they're out there ready to get in trouble with it. This goes particularly if you get into a mainstream and plus combined list. If your area is dancing plus, and you teach all the mainstream calls first, even in a good order, and then you go on to teach the plus calls, which tend to be more difficult, which is why they're on the plus list instead of the mainstream list. All of a sudden, you're putting all your hard calls off towards the end, and your dancers have had very little practice time on those before being integrated into your plus area dancing. That's one of the strong reasons I recommend an integrated list if you're in primary dances or integrated dances.
Sorry about that. We're working here. Get ever ready, not Ray back.
So I'll talk more at the end. You want to try that now? Oh, okay. I want the old battery. I'll try to talk more later about the mechanics of putting a good list together, but one of them is you've got several things you can go through your list, and you know which the calls are that are more difficult and need more practice. And when I say don't teach similar things close together, one of the things that makes calls similar is the difficulty. You don't want to teach all your difficult calls the third night. You want to do one difficult call a night only. Spread them out. So, or every other night if you have the luxury of a long series of lessons. And so, depending on, again, how long your series is and how many calls you get to teach a night, be it 2 calls or 6 calls, you've got to use some filler calls in there that are easy to learn, commonly used, and complement the more difficult call, but not be confused with it because of having a similarity. So again, teach difficult calls as early as you can, not more than one a night.
Can I add a comment about that?
Yes.
Unfortunately, we don't have both mics working, and we apologize for that technical problem. How many of you all have finished a group and whether it's 20 weeks or 30 weeks. And what your group, when you get on the floor and they're dancing, they seem to get the spin the tops, the Dixie styles, the tags, and the latter ones more confused. Is that something common? Is everybody having that same problem? How about a show of hands? All right. Now, so the thing that's going on is the list or the teaching order is bottom heavy. We are teaching the more involved calls at the end of our program when we have little floor time for them to be able to dance it. And it just seems to me, and it was very logical when we were trying to come up with this order, that we need to integrate the more difficult calls and introduce them sooner in the program so that they will have more floor time. So at the end of the 20-week session or 25 or however many you have, then these folks are going to be more proficient with those more technical calls. And to me, that just seemed like a no-brainer, and actually it works. In the program that I'm teaching, I have cloverleaf probably in the fourth session, and it fits very good after a slide through and double pass-throughs, and they're moving. And the dancers have a sensation of dance because they're getting wind in their face. And that's really, and that's a thing of success. Remember when you learned Grand Square, the charge you got because, wow, I was on my own for 32 beats of music. And I've accomplished this thing, and it was fun. And I had that much, I had a drive that I could do that. Dancers get the same high, if you will, out of goal posting. They get the same high, if you will, out of the cloverleafs and doing double pass-throughs and cloverleafs. And all of a sudden, you're changing their orientation, north, east, south, west, and they're moving and they're changing partners. And next thing you know, they have everybody back. They're resolved. It's like, wow, we danced. We got through all that. Instead of your star through, pass through, bend the line, star through, pass through, bend the line drills.
Wait a minute, I want to write that down.
I'm just saying. Now, these are good drills, okay, and so Don's going to show us some other things, but I just wanted to jump in. I, in fact, have taken his ideas, and I have separated flutter wheel and reverse flutter wheel just to see. And he was right. It worked. They did remember the other call, and they did know that this is the new call. And this was the old call. But be careful when you refer to something as the old call, because one time I said, now,
the old friend.
The old friend. I used it old call, and I said, now remember the old lady's chain. So, yeah, and that created a little problem. But they understood. They forgave, and we're still working with them today. But it was a laughter thing, and I'm using that now as part of my shtick. And but we do have to entertain. We do have to figure and devise ways to integrate the more technical, the more involved calls earlier in the program, and which is a great idea. We were talking, and Don was talking about the positive transference of ideas, like a weave the ring. If they know right and left grand first, later on, weave the ring is very easy to introduce because let's do that right and left grand with no hands. And they're doing it, and it's very simple now. And that's a positive transference of good teaching and learning skills. They're going to learn that material very relatively easy. There are some calls, and Don referenced this too, that I refer to as negative transference. A flutter wheel and Dixie style, for whatever reason, feel alike. And if you do Dixie style, and they've already learned flutter wheel, and they want to walk across the street and not do a lady's chain action, then why not take the call flutter wheel and teach it later? I don't need it. I can do ladies chain and do a pass through and a partner trade, and I've essentially done something the same if I want to change the men over, if that's all I want to do. So the idea here is if something has a negative transference, then separate them on your program that you're going to teach. So I will, and I have, and had great success at referencing the Dixie style because it feels like a little less than a lady's chain. Men, stay on your own side of the square. We're going to chain the ladies Dixie style to an ocean wave. And wow, the success rate was 95%. That's good, because everybody got it the first time, because they stayed on their own side. They saw it was a ladies' chain action. They grabbed that left hand. They didn't finish the courtesy turn. It was a little less than a ladies' chain. Later on, when I introduce flutter wheel, later on, now they know this flutter wheel is this arm hold thing that takes you across and brings you back and brings the other person back. And that's a key difference in when you put those calls in. We so oftentimes have trouble with square throughs and right and left throughs and wanting but courtesy turn. And so you can sometimes separate those actions too, so that they don't get that confusing factor into play.
Tim talked about the good wind in your face from goal posting. I'm going to get to later the fact that I like to leave goal posting for much later, and I'll tell you my reasoning for that, which is it's nothing against wind in your face. That's great, but I have some other reasons for it. He also mentioned something that got me thinking about something that's got nothing to do with teaching, but faux pas for the old ladies chain.
The old call.
The old, yeah. Well, I was calling a dance once and went into sort of automatic pilot of calling patter stuff, and I said the four little ladies chain across, and all of a sudden one of the many things you think of when you're calling said, oh, you got to be politically correct, and the best I could do was to say, and you big ladies go too. They were lined up at the stage after the tip. You big ones go too. And oh, wrong thing.
Things we learn.
Yeah, wow. But you know, now that I think about it, the embarrassment I got there for having done that was worth the many laughs I've got for the times I've told that story since. What page did I think I was on? and once I was ready for that, what makes me think I can find that page? The next item, and I don't think this is as important, but I still think it's fairly worthwhile, is don't teach patterns. The dancers should learn the individual calls before they learn the patterns of how they're typically used. Common patterns that should be taught separately, the calls separately, is lead right and circle to a line. There's plenty you can do with lead to the right before you do circle to a line. And there's ways to get into an 8-chain through setup that will still flow into a circle to a line. Centers in and cast off 3/4. Now granted, in my calling, I don't call centers in very often at all unless I call a cast off 3/4 after it. But I still want the dancers to know the separate parts. I'll give you some more examples in a moment. But one of the things is, after you've taught them the separate calls and used them separately for 2 or 3 weeks, do start using the standard patterns that we normally use together more frequently than other ways of calling it. Because you do want them to learn those patterns. You want them to be able to integrate into the group, to be able to not be thrown by, oh, they did a circle to a line after a lead to the right. So use those patterns and teach them, but first, before that, teach them the individual calls. And your teaching order will show you the first part. It won't show you to use these patterns, but you should know it in your calling. Another example is flutter wheel and sweep a quarter. Now, I know Tim had these together.
At first. I learned.
The example I used from that is I was calling, one of the local callers asked me to fill in for his class, and because he couldn't make it next week, and I said, he said, I'll give you all the calls they know. And I said, fine, but also tell me the ones you taught last week and the week before, so I know which ones have to be reviewed and retaught and everything. And he said, well, last week I taught flutter wheel and sweep a quarter. I like to use them together because they go so nicely together. And yes, they do, but I decided not to mention sweep a quarter and just teach flutter wheel, and so that they would be separated. I had a dancer come up to me after the tip and said, oh, that's where it ends. But, Andy. We have a lot of and don'ts as modifiers that way. Swing through, spin the top right and left through. Teach the calls separately. Pass through, and I'm going to ones that are not used as often, but pass through, wheel and deal, double pass through, first couple go left, next couple go right. That's not used as often as it used to be, I think, but it's still used a lot. And going back even further, pass through, wheel and deal, double pass through, centers in, cast off, 3/4. But repeated 3 times because it zeroes out. I remember as a dancer, I used to think, wow, this caller's challenging us because he's getting 2 guys together, half-sashayed couples and everything. I found out later he's calling it this way because that's the only way he knew to resolve afterwards. But don't do it in your classes. Don't do it in use it if your choreography you want, but don't do it in your classes. Separate those patterns. Moving on to the next item. What did I write here? Don't waste time teaching from formations or arrangements that are rarely used. I know I've been to many talks on teaching where people will talk, well, I teach square through this way, I teach square through that way. I tend to teach it a different way. But some of the guys, you know, I'll get 4 guys together, I'll get the couples half-sashayed, you know, and they teach them so that they can learn the basic principle of the call pretty well that day. But they never call them that way. I've known these guys, and they're fairly standard in their arrangements in how they call. So they've wasted time teaching them things that they will not be using as a dancer. Not in their club, not in that local program. You know, if your local area does a lot of opposition dancing, fine, teach it everywhere you can. But if your local club doesn't do it that much, don't bother teaching the variations that aren't used that much. We don't have that much time to teach them stuff they aren't going to use. This one's related to it. Teach opposition dancing if feasible. But on harder calls, teach it one way and one way only until they learn that, and then go to the next version. Now, when you define the call initially, don't get totally technical on how you say it, but make your definition broad enough so that the variation will not be contradicting what you said. Don't teach a shortcut or shortcut terminology, because you're going to have 1 or 2 guys in there and say, well, I wrote down that you said these words, and now this doesn't fit this. But teach it the way it's most oftenly used. Teach it one way. And then later on, go back and say, if you have time and if it fits, hey, one of the neat things about this call is we can also do it from here. And this adds variety. You don't have to teach them anything new other than walking them through so their body rote movements get the feel for it from a different way. But teach them the most common stuff first on the more difficult calls. Now, there's some calls when I figure like AC-doocy, there seems to be enough. The rules are pretty simple so that whether you teach it from 2-face lines or waves or right-hand waves or left-hand waves, you can extend all positions right away. But other calls like relay the doocy, you don't want to mess with that. Or square through. As I say, only teach the ways that you will continue to use regularly.
Just a time check. We have about 25 minutes left.
Okay. One short section, and the next one says, if time permits. The last one, and this is important, and your handout has this at the beginning. How is it possible to teach all these calls, like the harder calls early in the session? What I found is that I try to teach position formations and very basic building block calls very early. I figure within 3 to 4 weeks, I can get them in 8-chain through setup, lines facing out, 2-face lines, all sorts of formations that most of our calls use with a few basic calls. If we had time, I'd probably walk you through, but just with right, and this is in your handout, right and left through, ladies chain, star through, pass through, U-turn back, bend the line, dive through. That will take you through most of the formations we have. Then a week later, I go from page 3 to page 4. Who took page 4? Did you? No. Oh, there it is. I think I don't know what order the handouts are, and the office collated that. A week later or so, I'll get into ocean waves as soon as I can. Do-si-do to a wave, step to a wave, so they feel comfortable with waves. The first call I'll teach out of waves is trade. Centers trade, ends trade. I'll eventually get them into, I forgot what number it is, 3 or 4 or both. Waves where you've got 2 men, 2 women, I'll say men trade. First of all, I'll have men use the terminology for centers, or men if the men are in the center and such, so they get used to hearing all that. If I have 2 men on one end, 2 women on the other end, I'll teach men trade, women trade, then centers trade. Men, you turn back, and I got lines facing in again, or something like that. I'll throw a run in reasonably soon, but I don't have that listed here. One of the things, another topic, difficulty of choreography, what makes things hard and what makes things easier, is position awareness, formation awareness, getting to know where the rest of the square is, not just where you are. I tend to use calls shortly after teaching waves like scoot back that makes them aware there's another wave that they're supposed to be parallel with. You know, use your right hand 3 times, put your left hand behind you. I like to use spin chain through early, or if it's an integrated plus, mainstream plus thing, I use spin chain the gears maybe the 3rd night, 4th night. And the reason, and this is getting into specifics, but we all know that teaching a 3/4 turn is a difficult thing. You know, I've tried the spin the top first, I've tried the fan the top first. 3/4 turn is a difficult thing. If I go to spin chain through or spin chain the gears, all of a sudden I've got those centers turning 3/4 of a turn, which is half, and a little bit more till you find an ocean wave across the center. They know where to stop because that other wave they attach and tie to it. It's getting a more difficult call in early, and it's giving them a place to stop on that 3/4 turn. And then I can work in these other calls later on. We've gone through that. Just very quick summary. Separate similar calls, names, or actions. Teach harder calls early so they have more time to practice with them. Don't waste time teaching the stuff that you're not going to use regularly or dancers aren't going to need. And adjust your order to fit what's being taught and how long you have to teach it in.
That's great. One of the things too that we were talking about, the goalpost idea, I like to teach the English-related terminology right up front. And what does that mean? Well, we say walk, circle left. It's kind of English. It's really not very difficult to do. You just tell them to circle left, and they pretty much have an idea. Pass through, go around one, separates or separate away from the partner. Those are English terms that I think dancers relate to. If you say turn around, that's very easy. They know what turn around is. You can tell them to go to the right as a couple, go to the right, or lead to the right. You say, oh, we call that lead right. And they start relating that the English term makes sense to the call on occasions, right? And so they come in with this notion, a lot of men do, mostly, that I can't, won't, don't want to do this. And you trick them because, look, they think, I can't dance this, I don't know this, I won't be able to do this. But if you start using English calls first, the pass through, separate away from the partner, go around one or go around two, come home, and there's your partner, swinger. Okay, well, you have to teach the swing action first. But the idea here is that you're using a lot of English, and they're dancing things, and they don't even realize. They leave thinking, boy, I knew more than I thought, because he was just giving me a direction how to go. Circle to the right, drop hands, walk that direction, keep going, single file. We call that going to the right, keep going, single file. And the answers, you trick them, and they think, wow, okay, I'm doing this. And it really wasn't that hard to learn. And so if you use those English terminology right up front, the pass-throughs, the separates, go around 2, swing. Pass-through, separate, go around 1, come into the middle. Pass-through, go ahead, split the outsides. Go around 1, come back down the middle. Circle up 4 halfway. Oh, great, I'm doing it. And they get this sense of accomplishment like they do with Grand Square right off the bat. And so I do like to use the English terminology right up front. It sort of tricks them. Another thing is I like to teach the essentials, just as Don said. I want to teach what is currently being danced. I'm going to defer the other material for later time, maybe at a workshop or maybe at a club dance or something else. So I've actually taken these calls, and I'll just read what I think is deferred, and I'll give you the reason why I defer them. I defer do-si-do to a wave, because you just tell them to step to a wave. They understand English better, do-si-do to a wave. Okay, let's go on to the next one. Wrong way grand. I defer that. I can get them to do the action, say do a right and left grand in this direction. Now later, if I really need the term wrong way grand, I can tell them. I'm deferring it to later. Do paso, I'm deferring it because I can tell them, and I teach them arm turns right up front. Turn your partner with a left arm turn. Turn your corner with a right arm turn. Come back to the partner, courtesy turn or whatever. And I don't need that term right up front to clutter all the material that they're having to learn already. All right, here's another one. You're going to be surprised. Star through. I defer it. I want to teach slide through, and I teach them it's a turning slideways action. They turn, they slide past each other, and they're ready to get the next call, get the hands held, and they're ready to go. Because the term star through, they get confused with what a right-hand star is, what a left-hand star is. And when I call star through, a lot of times they form this four-hand star. And I have accidentally called star through to the group that I haven't shown star through yet, and that's exactly what they did. They put a four-hand star up there, they turned a quarter and faced in. And that's close, but not quite. And I made a mistake. I said, oh, I haven't shown you. I apologize, because it's difficult to take that out of my language. I'm teaching slide through to beginners, all right? And I'm teaching slide through the third night, rather than star through. They can do it just as easy as star through. They really can. And if you're thinking, well, I need that hand for balance, I need hand calls. No, because a lot of the armpit calls today, I see the ones that we call them armpit calls, because they have to raise the dancers are getting a little older. They can't raise the hand up. They can't do that action as easy as some can. All right, defer that. All around the corner seesaw. I know they're very danceable actions. In modern choreography, we don't use a lot of that. You dance them in an evening dance once, twice, maybe, okay? But for our modern choreography, that's not the meat and potatoes what we use, all right? California twirl, oddly enough, I'm teaching partner trade first. I'll defer for later. Dive through, slip the clutch, shoot the star, box the mat, Alamo style, and turn through. Those are calls I'm deferring to the end, or later, or at a workshop with my group. That's 13 calls. All right, now I've integrated all the others sooner, and they're dancing, they're doing all these things. Defer these others to later. If I have time, I'll show them. It's not difficult to show the Thar family at a workshop or at a dance, right? It's not difficult to say, now step to a wave, and we can do-si-do to a wave, if I need that in my vocabulary. I'm determined that we really don't need some of those things in our vocabulary, all right? But that's for a later session, okay? All right? But the idea here is to integrate all the calls in. My goal is for them to dance mainstream in this particular session for my group. And I'm going to do it. I have a session listed for 20 weeks, how to get them up to that point, with even review nights to be able to get that. Of course, your first groups, you're learning a whole lot more, like Don said. You're learning a whole lot of calls the first 2 or 3 weeks. Towards the latter parts of it, you're maybe only introducing 2 calls a night, because there's a whole lot of review you got to do, and it's just part of it. So the whole goal, gang, and we had to take some questions, I know, is to experiment with an order that's going to fit your zone, your region of dance. Experiment by putting some of the more difficult calls, integrate them sooner, it's a challenge. It's a challenge for me, too, because choreographically I have to come up with things that I can't say swing through right off, and I'm used to using that call, or boys run after I haven't taught that yet. So it's a challenge for us, too, to come up choreographically what to do with some of these things. But if any of you wish to have or a copy of the 2 sheets, Don has the handout. I have my order, and I have a experimental teaching order. I have them available. Home office does not have those yet. The PPC is going to be getting those, and they have the committee that they're working on just these things, because everybody has their own order. Different goals, however. Some only want to teach 50 calls. Some want to teach 12, 14 calls. Some want to teach full mainstream. Some orders want to teach all the way through plus. So just be aware of that.
Just to try and make a couple quick calls, comments. Can't even read my, goal posting. I break calls down into sloppy calls and precise calls. And as I say, one of the difficult parts of dancing for dancers, the things that make it difficult is formation awareness, being aware of the rest of the square as well as your own part. And sloppy calls tend not to lend themselves as much to that. And I feel goal posting is more of a sloppy call than head start through, pass through, go right and left through, 8-chain through stuff. More wind in your face, sloppier call, and harder to teach formation awareness early. Ingredients for you to think about when you're doing. I feel that handhold stuff is easier for dancers to orient the correct direction after they're done. I teach start through early, not slide through. Teach slide through really late. My dancers don't confuse star through with right-hand stars and left-hand stars, because to me, right-hand stars are a sloppy call, and I defer them to maybe the second to last night. For me, a call starts here and ends here. Where does the right-hand stars end? Or, you know, by your corner for an Alaman left, okay, or when you choose to say it. And everybody gets to their corner at a different time because of timing. This square starts right away. This one thinks about it for a while. This one goes the other way and then catches up. So the ending position is kind of tough to find a good spot to end a star for me. Yet I've seen this so many other callers use it very successfully. Do-si-do-do wave, it's a wind in your face thing and they can do easily, but yeah, you could defer that if you want. Anyway, I want to mention that I'm so pleased to see so many of you here interested in this topic. This is great.
Very quickly, we are going to come to you for some, to see if anybody has additional comments on it. Just very quickly, we started out with a teaching order that CALLERLAB recommends. That is the teaching order that a lot of people follow so that your dancers can dance with somebody else's dancers at the halfway point in their dancing careers. However, I have found my experience with that has been that they'll go to one of those halfway dances and have a caller call the exact same call that I taught them, only he uses different words or a different accent. There are a lot of different accents in Virginia. And they never had that call before. Well, yes, you did. But what I'm saying is that I think that having the teaching order solidified into one format simply so that your dancers can travel to some other dancers halfway through their learning thing is probably not nearly as important as teaching them well. And I think what these two guys have been talking about is teaching them well. And what we want to encourage now is we want to encourage experimentation, try things out. We don't want you to go crazy. Don't bring in or relay the squirrel, but do teach the calls that need to be taught, teach them in a logical, reasonable. And if you want to know if your dancers are dancing to patterns rather than to the calls, have square through 4, do-si-do, veer to the left. Yeah, veer to the left they won't do. Now, I'd like to open up the floor for comments, but you're going to have to come up here and speak into the mic to make your comments. Please feel free. You may mention your name if you want everybody in the world to know who you are on the tape.
Yeah, we like Yeah, I know how long this cord is. Virgil Forbes from Laurel, Maryland, one of the small core of CALLERLAB certified square dance teachers. I have been teaching an average of 3 beginner classes a year for the last 10 years. And out of those last 30 classes, if you put them together, never exactly the same order, because every group is different. I'm a wind-in-your-face kind of guy. First week, lead to the right, veer to the left, couples circulate. Bend the line. Get back out of it. No problem. But the whole concept is analyze your group. What is going to work for them? I have 22 weeks to get to mainstream, another 12 weeks to get to plus. I'm in a Washington, Baltimore metro area where I think there are 2 mainstream clubs out of 70. So plus is destination. When they graduate, they do not dance good plus. My criteria for them for graduation is if they are in a square and nobody else goofs, they're going to get where they're going. That's not a very stringent criteria. I acknowledge that. Do I wish otherwise? Yes, I do. I, like you, I defer goal posting way down the list because I did a call analysis at our local festival about 6 years ago. Never heard pass-through separator round 1 come into the middle. At best, pass-through separator round 1 squeeze into a line. So I'm trying to teach what I'm hearing called at the local festival by the likes of Marriner and Miller and Jimmy Lee and whoever we've invited. The other thing, 2 other things. Number 1, if I'm trying to teach something and they're not getting it, I get rid of it, leave it to next week. Don't try to bash their heads into the wall teaching something they're not ready for that night. Don't get them frustrated. You can be frustrated all you want, but don't let them get frustrated. The third thing, and my dancers hear almost every call, this is the 90% solution. This is the 90% setup. So they're aware of what is standard formation, what the starting formation, ending formation is, because every call changes formation or changes where you are in the formation. That's what defines a call. And don't be afraid to teach from singing call figures, because that's what they have fun dancing.
Andy Shore, recently from South Florida. I too have taught about 2 or 3 beginners classes a year since about 1990 until now, just 1 a year now that I'm in South Florida, but that'll hopefully change. And I have not used the CALLERLAB recommended teaching order ever. But I do that because I have spent time thinking about it and talking to smart people and thinking about it again on my own. I like to teach building block calls first. I teach trades and circulates very early on, and before they've learned about ocean wave, they've actually probably danced through them from line spacing out, you know, boys trade down the line, girls trade down the line, that kind of thing. I teach cast off 3/4 before I teach spin the top. You know, they're not that way on the CALLERLAB teaching order, but you know, they will have casted by the right and casted by the left 3/4 for a few weeks from columns or from just ocean waves before they've seen spin the top. I also try, and you didn't touch on this, Don, and I was a little surprised about the confusion aspects. The starting formation of calls, things that feel similar to them. I try not to teach 2 wave calls, one in the same night, or 2 box calls in the same night. So especially at mainstream, I won't teach spin the top and recycle on the same evening, or I won't teach scoot back and walk and dodge on the same evening, because they start from the same place. And so the confusion, the crossover in students' minds, you can just kind of avoid that sometimes. And also in the formation awareness category, I will often dance them in just 2 couple setups when they're dancing 2 or 4 person calls, and when we're drilling that and working that, so that they understand that on spin the top, they're not working with everybody else in the square, they're only working down a wave, scoot back, that kind of thing. I want to urge everybody to experiment on their own. Don't take anybody else's word as gospel on this. think about the logic behind your own teaching order and question yourself, which I do every year. I fine-tune my teaching order every year a little bit. I'll think, and why did I put that there again? You know, I'm gonna change the order of this. I'm gonna move this to this week a little bit. I'm constantly changing it because every year at CALLERLAB I get a new good idea that inspires me to change my thinking a little bit. There are great resources out there to look at and for you to use as resources. In the Santa Clara Valley for many years, they used a single session integrated plus list called The List, a logical integrated single session teaching order. They pretty much abandoned that in the area as and every club taught to that, and that way they had new dancer hoedowns to a certain point in that. They have abandoned that in recent years, but it's a list that has a rationale behind it. Again, it was teaching an integrated list so that they learned some of the plus calls earlier, trying to teach the higher frequency common calls first and deferring the less frequent, less commonly run into ones in modern choreography, teaching building blocks first and so on. I urge you to go do a Google search for that, look at it, try to understand the rationale behind it, and then come up with your own rationale behind your own. Joe Justin has some of his teaching order stuff on his website that he uses in Yuma with. It's a different crowd. You know, his audience is different, his rationale is different, but read through what he has to say about it, and you'll get a perspective that you can then apply to your own thinking. And I really want to urge that. And I have a question that one of you may know. A few years back, actually it's back in the last millennium, CALLERLAB floated a alternative mainstream teaching order as a proposal. Yeah, and it had a time limit on it to expire by a certain year, and it expired. And I actually used that, and my current teaching order is based on that. It's not identical to that. I think it was better. And I wanted to know sort of what the standing of that was, whether that should be brought back into the mix. Since we're, okay. Yeah, I'd love to see it just sort of as part of this discussion is to bring that back as just one of the. Kenny Ferris wrote it? Okay. It was a good improvement. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ruth Regelhaupt-Herzig. I'm from Sunnyvale, California. I've been teaching 2 to 3 classes since 2002, so I don't nearly have as many years as any of the people who have been up so far, but I was happy to hear that my teaching order was not far off from anything you've brought up, so that was good news. An issue that was brought up twice today was the question of beginners dances and the different orders. And we're very, very fortunate that the webmaster for our group is also the webmaster for the local Dancers Association. And what he has done is he contacts all the clubs in the area to find out what they're teaching each week. And then posts on the website where you can put in the club names. Only callers know how to reach this site. Only we know how to access what has been taught at each of the club. And there's a chart that shows these are the things that have been taught so far. So when somebody goes to do a beginner's dance, they look at the chart and they see which ones all the clubs that are attending know, and they use a combination of those calls. So for those of you who live in high-tech areas who have a webmaster, you can find somebody to do that. Those of you who don't, perhaps you can recruit a high schooler, because all of them will know how to do it. And it works. It works really well. We have so many different orders in our area, and beginners do not get discouraged at the beginner dances. Thank you.
Anybody else have any significant comments? We have about 1 minute, so.
Keep this short. Chris Pinkham, Hillsborough, New Hampshire. I like what Tim said. We often forget that when we are teaching people how to dance, that we are teaching a foreign language along with physical skills. So it's very important to start out with stuff that's recognizable to our common language, which is still English at this point. So again, we're applying a foreign language to some people and teaching physical skills at the same time. It's a double whammy, so I like the approach. Teach common English first. If you walk up to the man on the street and say spin, chain, through, they're going to go, huh? So teach them something that they can recognize as part of their environmental experiences as they age. I'm 5th year into multi-cycle now, which means we've taught 10 to 13 classes in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, and Common English works best when we first get started. So thank you. That was a good point.
Hi, I'm Steve Greenham from Salem, New Hampshire. I am a significant other, so I don't teach square dances. But having gone to many classes, I had one question on the approach to formation awareness. Having been through a lot of class, it seems to be a stumbling block that I see in a lot of students. So I was wondering how you approached doing formation awareness within the teaching order.
I know that as far as formation awareness, now Don and I might disagree on this. I'm kind of thinking we might, so I'm going to hand it over to him real quick right after I answer. I really don't worry about it until I get to circulates. Circulates is the first call where they have to be aware of formations. They have to know where to leap to. They have to look to it and then go there. Circulates is the first call. We want them to know if they're in lines, if we're in waves, if I'm in columns, or what have you. So at that point, then I worry about it. Otherwise, we're normally dancing them through formations, in and outs, with the exception of we say step to a wave. They're going to know what a wave is, and eventually they know what lines are. But to educate them that this is a line, this is a squared set, this is a that's kind of like color techno things in my mind. But
oh, no way, no. Now, when I teach formation awareness, I don't teach formation terminology. I just, as I say, when I want them to know that there's more to their wave, that there's another one. Scoot back helps me show them there's another wave there across. I don't tell them I'm doing this. If I've got lines of 4 and I do pass through, bend the line, I want them to know that they end up in a line and there's other people coming at them from the other side of the square. I'm basically showing them, you know, making them aware by having them dance through this and having to become aware for where the next person's coming at them. Don't use the terminology, and the calls I use are ones that stress this kind of thing when they're doing, so that's part of the order.
Excuse me, the only thing that I would say about formation awareness is that I do mention it only because there are some few dancers who want to know that kind of information. You always have somebody who's asking questions about the calls or something like that. So when I introduce a new formation, I do mention, look, this is a line. Everybody's facing in the same direction. This is a line. This now is a two-faced line. But that's all. After that, you know, it's where am I and why am I lost that's important. If anybody has any other questions, I thank you all. How about a nice hand for our panelists who did a lot of work putting this together. Good work, guys. Thank you for coming. Hope you got something out of it. Don's handout is up here. Feel free to grab them. And yours are going to be, see Tim if you want one of his.